I'm Pat Boyde, and I'm talking from my room in college, St John's College in Cambridge. And the place is significant because I spent most of my life in and around college since 1953. And I started the study of Dante as I started the study of Italian from scratch on the day I arrived in Cambridge.
Very good. And I'm John Bruce Jones. I'm sitting not 20 miles away from Cambridge. I'm not an academic. I'm someone who's come back to Dante and the Divine Comedy after more than 20 years. I was a student of Pat's and I was a lecturer in Italian literature many years ago. The pandemic and the lockdown gave me the urge to pick up Dante's poem and read it from start to finish as great poetry. Partly, I have to say, to see how it would engage me now, half a lifetime from when it was my main academic focus. Pat, you need little introduction, but you're not going to do it, so I think I will. Pat is Emeritus Professor of Italian at Cambridge. He's the author of a number of substantial works on Dante, a critical edition and a major study of the lyric poetry, concentrating on the style, and then three major studies of the comedy, which focus on the poetic expression of the ideas within the context of the intellectual background. I hope that's right. Pat, you once said to me that the first volume of your trilogy was inspired by some of the lines that we're going to be looking at Paradiso 1. And the subtitle of that first volume is Man in the Cosmos. So I guess that's one of our broader themes. But anyway, I wanted to say I was very struck in my reading by how the move into Paradiso is a comprehensive going beyond what came before. There's the obvious going beyond the material world into the heavens. There's a going beyond what's normally possible for humans physically and intellectually.
Now, I totally agree, by the way, with your sense of the Paradiso as more than just the start of a new canto, but a new start. And before we get stuck into our conversation, I'd like to stress that I too am returning to the comedy after an absence of nearly 20 years, during which time I've been busied with other great poets in other languages. And now, as I come back to Dante, I'm coming back to my original interest in the style and the language, specifically on the sounds and the rhythms and the verbal music of his poetry. And I remind you of his fighting words in his Convivio, that which has been bonded together by the bond of the muses cannot be translated from one language to another without losing all its sweetness and harmony. So let's get going. We ought perhaps to remind our listeners of the obvious, of the situation in the narrative at the point where Dante is about to resume his journey. So Dante the Pilgrim is in the Garden of Eden, otherwise known as the earthly paradise. He and Beatrice are standing, poised, ready for a space flight that will take them beyond the physical heavens of the medieval cosmos and take them beyond, as you stressed, into the celestial paradise. That's, in other words, into the present, into heaven as it is normally understood, into the presence of God.
Yeah, so at the beginning of Paradiso, we're still for a very short time on planet Earth. And before we go beyond before the blast off, let's underline the big change for the reader compared to the final cantos of Purgatorio. I have to admit in my recent reading that when I came to cantos 32 and 33, I found them difficult. I found them difficult to understand. I found them difficult to engage with. All that pageantry and obscure symbolism and allegory. Moving from there as the reader into the first canto of Paradiso felt like moving from a cluttered Victorian parlour into some Scandinavian architecture with clear lines and light and space and air.
I have to say I rather agree with you about the allegorical pageant of sacred history at the end of Purgatory, and I must say at this point in the poem I'm more than ready to leave behind the figure of Dante as the individual, as the penitent sinner in the year 1300 living in Florence, and I'm ready now to see how he's represented in the poem as a representative of humankind. Of humankind at its best, a little lower than the angels, but nevertheless sharing with the angels something, a power called intellect, which gives us the power to understand the truth, to understand the truth about our own nature and humanity, and in the end, to understand our true place in the cosmos.
Yeah. As you mentioned the cosmos, and I want to pick up on your space travel analogy. I can't resist the feeling that this is the science fiction of the 14th century, and I can't resist comparing it with the science fiction I enjoy today. Here there is some extraordinary and mind-bending travel. It's mind-bending for the character in the journey, but also for the reader. And then, like in good science fiction, there's a scientific explanation that follows, or at least an explanation that works as pseudoscience. The point is, it's not just magic. It's not just with one bound he was in heaven. There is a logic. There's an interstellar warp drive, if you like. The Canto tells us about the moment of liftoff, what it felt to be like inside the spacecraft. It tells us a little about the technology and particularly about the fuel of the journey. And it kind of ends with an anthem in praise of the perfect order in the cosmic space in which they're traveling. So just to say a little bit about how it works, Beatrice fixes her gaze directly into the sun. Dante's drawn to do the same. Somehow he's acquired the power to tolerate the brightness. And as he does, he sees sparks all around, like molten iron pouring from a furnace. Then the light of the sun doubles in brightness. And finally, he perceives a vast lake of light mirrored in a sound of celestial harmony. And at that point, he's filled with an unnamed desire, and he's clearly arrived somewhere. Kind of what the desire is and where he has arrived, we will find out. Dante coins the verb trasumanare in this description, transhumanizing, to describe how the act of transcending beyond the earth takes him beyond the limitations of the human body. And then a few lines later, Beatrice explains he's travelled instantaneously, faster than lighting, away from earth, into the transparent ether of the first heaven, into the body of the moon itself. We learn later how this is possible. Lots of big ideas here, a Pandora's box that could be opened, and we could talk for hours, but Pat, are there a couple that are particularly relevant?
I think that is worthwhile. I mean, the interest and the trouble with medieval thought is that it is the classic example of what's called the hermeneutic circle. So you can't understand the details until you've grasped the whole, and you can't grasp the whole until you've understood the details. But I'll do my best. I'll try and pick out and talk about three key words. Intellect, we've already mentioned, and we need to talk about movement and love, about natural movement. What we are moving towards is an understanding of a widely quoted axiom in medieval thought, that all agents whatsoever perform any act whatsoever out of some kind of love. It sounds better in Latin. Omnia agunt, quodcumque agunt, ex aliquo amore. Okay, let me try and fill that up. Let's take the simplest example of this action. We'll take a species near the middle of the rung, on the middle rung of the ladder of being, shall we say. Imagine then an animal. An animal needs water to survive. And it has a natural appetite for water. Water is a necessary good, a bonum, as they say. And animal always has, in some sense, a love of water. When it's lacking in water, it feels thirsty, and the thirst makes it get up and move towards a stream. When it drinks from the stream, it ceases to feel thirst, and it comes to a state of rest. Okay, so the scholastics talk about love in both its aspects as a virtus unitiva. It brings two things together, but you have to remember always the two phases. In the first phase, desire for something you have not got, which causes movement towards it. And the second phase is enjoyment of the thing when you're united with it, fruition, as they call it. So we're coming back to the axiom. In scholastic Latin, love can be called the principle of movement, the cause of movement, and also the principle of natural coming to rest. Those are the big ideas in the background.
So if I've got it right, Pat, you're saying that for Dante, love is a force that can drive physical movement, and it perpetuates a kind of satisfied, stable state. I can't help feeling there are echoes of physics here, modern physics.
Yeah, spot on, I believe. Okay, so let's take it a bit further. So this paradigm I've just sketched out with the animal and water and thirst is valid not only for animals and so on, it's valid for everything in the universe, right down to the bottom of the scale, right down to the four elements themselves. Okay, so what we call weight or gravity is, in Dante's understanding, simply the love felt by the element earth for its proper place in the center of things, in the center of the universe, for the center of gravity. So it works below the animal level, but it also works above the purely animal level. And we need to come on now to this third term, intellect. What is intellect? So the same paradigm, okay, of movement caused by desire, rest causing by getting what you wanted, holds good also for the purely mental processes where we don't move around at all, that arise from our human love, our permanent love for understanding the truth, for moving towards the truth. So metaphorically speaking, it's a desire to understand some new phenomenon that you've experienced in the real world, something you don't understand in somebody's explanation of that phenomenon, which sets up a desire, which leads you on to study, to investigate, until you come to an understanding of that particular problem. And you go on and on from one truth to the next truth to the next truth. And in the end, you realize that this same desire for the truth, this intellectual desire, is what's driving you on to truth with a capital T, which is the truth you'll only know in the presence of God, in paradise. Now, believe it or not, it's a long explanation, but everything I've been trying to say in the last minute or so is directly relevant to the meaning of the story, the literal story in our canto. I've actually just paraphrased Dante's own summary of the cause of his flight, the rocket fuel of his flight up into the moon. And he says in the beginning of the second canto, we were carried upwards at almost celestial velocity by a concreated and perpetual thirst of a kingdom which is in the likeness of God.
Yeah. La concreata e perpetua sete del deiforme regno ci portava veloci quasi come il ciel vedrete. Marvelous stuff. In this, I mean, Dante's counterpart in the world of today is not Elon Musk, really, preparing his spacecraft for a journey to Mars. I think it's much more like the abstract thinkers of the stature of Einstein, connecting space, time, and light in a grand theory, or Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking, whom you and I used to see at lunch in the Cambridge Graduate Centre all those years ago, who came up with the image of the black hole, which is a metaphor of fantastic potentiality, which I kind of feel Dante would have loved, would he not?
He would have loved it. Yes.
And so this concept of the universe as a system which seeks its proper balance is one we're familiar with today. We understand how systems in nature work, about forces and self-regulation and homeostasis. We know natural systems seek stability, whether at the smallest atomic scale or at the scale of the universe. We're kind of familiar today with the idea of ineluctable and hidden cosmic forces underneath all everyday phenomena. Anyway, as the canto ends, it ends with this great celebration of order in the cosmos.
It's lovely. Okay. Well, I have to explain that when John and I first accepted the invitation to choose a slot, when we'd chosen this slot, we decided from the beginning we were going to end up with this great, let's call it an anthem to universe, to movement and love in the cosmos. And we decided we would take the six terzinos of this anthem, we would put them up on screen and translate them for you, and then we try to read them aloud, and we try to convey as best we can that essential dolcezza and armonia, which turns it into a hymn. We're trying to end with the harmony, a harmony which Dante is creating out of these ideas in imitation of God. Dante is a poet, a craftsman who loves harmony. The greatest craftsman and the greatest poet, the greatest factor is God. So that is the spirit of what we're going to do in this anthem now.
Very good. So let's see if I can get this to work. Right.
So here are the first words then. They're spoken by Beatrice, and she's correcting one of Dante's mistakes. And she says, all things whatsoever have order among themselves. And this is the form which makes the universe similar to God.
Here, the highest creations, the angels, see the imprint of the eternal power and love, which is the final goal for which that order, that above-mentioned order, was made.
In this order I'm speaking of, all natures are inclined, but by different destinies. Some are more close vicine to their principio, to their origin, and some are less close, men vicine.
Therefore, they move to different ports over the great sea of being, and each one with the instinct, the particular instinct that's given to it, that carries it.
It's this, the instinct, that carries fire up towards the moon. It's the same instinct which is the motive force in mortal hearts, in animal hearts. It is this which stringe ad una, compresses and binds, unifies earth in itself.
And it's not only those created beings that are without intelligence that are launched forth as if by this bow on their journey, but those which have intellect and love.
Le cose tutte quante hanno ordine tra loro, e questa è forma che l'universo a Dio fa somigliante.
Qui veggion l'alte creature l'orma dell'eterno valore, il quale è fine al quale è fatta la toccata norma.
Nell'ordine che io dico, sono accline tutte nature per diverse sorti, più al principio loro e men vicine.
Onde si muovono a diversi porti per lo gran mar dell'essere, e ciascuna con istinto a lei dato che la porti.
Questi ne porti il fuoco in ver la luna, questo il cor mortale è per motore, questa la terra in sé stringe e aduna.
Neppur le creature che son fore d'intelligenza quest'arco saetta, ma quelle che hanno intelletto e amore. Right, Pat, there we are. We sort of got to where we wanted to. We've got a couple of minutes. Just reflecting, this Canto of Paradiso for the reader, is this representative of the best of Dante? Would you say this is Dantesque as a canto?
I think the very word, the one thing it isn't is Dantesque, as this word is normally used today. It's a complete journalistic cliche which you trot out to any kind of disaster or horror. And it is only used by people who either never read the poem at all or have read a bit of hell in English and know nothing else about Dante. So Dantesque is a right-out word. If you want to say is it like Dante as we know him from the rest of the poem and the rest of his work, then it is Dantean. So I want to stress hell, which is what most people read and where most people stop. I'm sorry to say, hell is not specifically Dantean, right? That wonderful order of the circles and the mathematical counting, that he takes from scholastic philosophy. The general feel of it is from popular beliefs about the afterworld. He takes a lot from frescoes and representations of the Last Judgment, all the tortures. And he's actually borrowing from Virgil, to some extent also from Ovid, even the models of the great encounters. So Francesca's modelled on Dido, and the others are Piero on Polydorus, for example. So it's very, very good, Inferno, and he does brilliantly all the things that he does. But Dante is not a poet who's interested in guilt and hate and things. He's interested in love and intellect. I get into my stride. His very first major poem, which he singled out in the comedy as being the place where the new poetry started, begins with the line, "Ladies who have understanding of love, donne che avete intelletto d'amore." The whole of the Vita Nuova is a story about gradually understanding amore for Beatrice. The final sonnet of the Vita Nuova contains the whole of the Paradiso in embryo, and it says, "Beyond the sphere which circles most widely my understanding, my feelings past, drawn up there by a new intelligence." So it's an intelligenza. Mm-hmm. He then moves on to the Convivio, which starts with the wonderful words of Aristotle, "All men by nature desire to know." And Dante offers you crumbs that he's gathered up from the table of the angels and offers you a banquet of learning. He then goes on to two major studies in Latin about the nature of language, logos, reason, intellect, and also the nature of world politics, of the De Vulgari and the Monarchia. Hell is a kind of space in between. In Purgatory, yes, it is like Dante again, when he writes about that feeling of relief at being in the new world, all the material relating to the Virgin, to talk about poetry going up towards Beatrice, that's all Dante. But he becomes Dante, really Dante, in this canto, when he's talking about man as the being who desires to understand. So intelletto e amore, the last two words of our anthem, are what it's all about. And this is genuinely Dantean. This is real Dante.
So this is where we should stop, or we'll go on for several hours. Very good. Thank you, Pat.